Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Weekly MTG, not on a Thursday, because today we are talking about the upcoming Warhammer 40,000 Commander decks. Now you may recognize the two people to my right over here from the video you just watched, all about Warhammer 40,000 and the development process. So we are going to dive more into that today, this hour, and we're going to show you some more preview cards. We got a few more of those coming. We're going to talk about the decks, we're going to talk about the art, we're going to talk about the process. So yeah, quick introduction to my guests. If you didn't catch them in the video before this, you really should. But if you didn't, Ovidio Cartagena, I did that right before the show as well, but I got it this time. Senior World Building Art Director. And then Ethan Fleischer, Senior Game Designer, who I've now had on the show like twice in about, it was like a month ago, I think. Oh, yeah, which is nice. It's nice to be back. And we appreciate you tuning in to learn more about the Warhammer 40,000 Commander decks. Now, if you're wondering how previews are going to go, how that whole thing is going to work, first of all, on dailymtg.com, there should be a where to find previews article that'll point you to all of that. But we're going to talk about some cards today, and then the next 4 days are all going to be dedicated to one deck each day. So we'll talk more about that. But let's start by talking about the 4 decks. Obviously, this is a Commander release, but this feels unique in that each of the 4 decks really has its own flavor. So let's start by talking about the Ruinous Powers. So I'm playing the role of the Magic fan who doesn't know anything about Warhammer 40,000 because that's just true. But my understanding is that both of you have background with Warhammer before this whole project kicked off. Is that the case, Ovidio? What was your experience?
Well, I used to play, I used to run a Necron army. I used to play 1,000 to 1,500 point, nothing like excessively big. And the Tyranid army. Tyranid is the thing I have the most experience with. Though, as a lore fan, I'm a fan of Chaos.
Okay. Ethan?
I've been playing Warhammer since the early 90s. Okay. So not for the entire history of Warhammer, but for a lot of it. And I continue to play to this day. I taught my family how to play, and we bust out the miniatures and have family game night with Warhammer. And yeah, and I'm a big collector of the really old Warhammer game manuals and miniatures from the 80s. I just love that early period where the creative juices were flowing and the rocks were still soft in the Warhammer 40,000 universe.
Would you say you know more about Warhammer 40,000 lore or Dominaria lore?
Oh, at this point, Dominaria, definitely.
Okay.
Like, that's my job.
All right, but you're pretty well versed in
yeah, I'm certainly an expert on the Ultramarines, who are my favorite Space Marine chapter.
All right.
I was a moderator on a Warhammer 40,000 forum for a while. So
okay.
I'm almost a professional in that regard.
Just flashing those bona fides all over the place. All right, so like I said, let's talk about the Ruinous Powers first. One of the first cards we showed off was Abaddon the Despoiler. So we've seen this card before, but for Magic fans out there who don't know anything about this, who is Abaddon? What are the Astartes? How do you pronounce that? Astartes. Tell us about them.
Right. So we wanted each deck to kind of feel like you were playing the army. It's a highly factionalized universe, and you have to combine people from the same faction together in your army. Yeah. So we did the same thing with the decks. And so the Chaos deck is an alliance of these Astartes, these Chaos Space Marines, who betrayed the Emperor 10,000 years ago, and in this event called the Horus Heresy, the huge civil war, the Imperium of man was riven in half of the forces declared for the evil Horus, half of them declared for the evil in a different way Emperor, and there was a huge war. Eventually the Chaos Space Marines were driven into the Eye of Terror, which is this huge warp storm where reality is bleeding off into chaos. Abaddon the Despoiler is a huge wheel in the Chaos Space Marine army. He's one of the greatest leaders they have, and he's got a grudge against the Imperium that has lasted for 10,000 years. He started out as a bioengineered super soldier, and since then his power has only grown as he's made alliances with demons and become swollen with arcane power granted to him by the 4 gods of chaos.
All right. So, Ovidio, a lot of, Ethan's talking about a lot of that background. There's also a lot of background to the way these characters look. So, how did you go about translating that to a Magic card?
So, the probably hardest part was being faithful to both the art that Games Workshop has produced and to the lore as it's seen in the models that people collect. Like, we took a lot of cues from the models, and fortunately for most of these, Games Workshop has like 3D turnarounds that we could access and take a look at, send to the artist and so on. Each one has their own flavor, different limitations proportionally, of course, and turning these into paintings was a pleasure, right? We got to get terrain in here, right? Like, we don't have environment references. So you take a look at the terrain that Games Workshop produces, that's fans love painting these things. People love painting. And we did it, we painted it too, but in a different way, right? Like, we just made it happen. We made it seem like you're not just in the battlefield, but on the game battlefield, how it feels when you're playing with your army of models. We wanted that feeling, those ideas that come into your head when you are rolling your D6s. We wanted that feeling of damage and power and strength to be communicated in the painting. The painting of Abaddon, the spoiler, was made by Johan Grenier. Matt Cavara was the AD for this one, but I love that art. It's one of my favorite arts in the whole set.
Yeah. Now, in case people don't know, whether cards are new or reprints in this set, everything has art that is new to Magic, correct?
All new art. All of the art featured in here has never been in a Magic card before.
Okay, and that was, and even beyond that, cards that are in multiple decks, they have different art to flavor the decks, correct?
Indeed, yes. Because each set is factionalized. We needed, even if we had the same card, we needed to give it the flavor to its own faction, so that when you're playing your own deck, it feels in world, it feels consistent. It feels like you're playing with your army.
Right, and the Imperium would never use a chaos artifact. It would probably be contaminated with demons or something, right? The Necrons would never lower themselves to using our primitive technology. So oftentimes, there will be cards that appear in multiple decks with different art bespoke to that deck to offer a consistent experience. The only exception there is some of the land cards cross over between decks with the same art. These are battlefields that they're fighting over, and so it seemed less important for us to theme all of the lands necessarily.
Makes sense. All right, let's talk about the next deck, which is Forces of the Imperium, which is led by Inquisitor Greyfax. So, Ethan, what's the Imperium? Who is this?
The Imperium is the worst case scenario for the future, where humanity has descended into the most brutal totalitarian state imaginable. Turns out that a bureaucracy that can run an empire that spans the entire galaxy can be quite soul-crushing. And it turns out that the universe is a hostile place. There are aliens out there, and all of them hate us and are at war with us. There is internal dissent, as you would expect in a totalitarian state. It has to be crushed ruthlessly. And demons are real, and if you think about them, they might make your head explode and come out and attack everyone nearby. So it's vitally important that the populace at large be kept completely ignorant about almost everything. To enforce these situations and sort of root out any sort of problems that may crop up, mostly internally, are the Inquisitors. Inquisitors are these very powerful, very well-equipped people who can call upon any military forces of the Imperium to assist them in their endeavors to root out alien influences, witchcraft, and revolution. So Inquisitor Greyfax is one of those. She can command almost anyone in the Imperium to assist her in her investigations.
All right. And Ovidio, what are some of the visual markers of the Imperium that differentiate them from the other factions?
Well, without going into the specific like shape, language, and so on, I'd like to talk about the Inquisitor Greyfax card. It was super amazing to work with Lee on it. I had the chance to art direct him on this, and this is a great example of the use of terrain as reference for this and attitude, right? The Inquisitor is accusing you, the viewer, for daring to think of anything other than God Emperor. And we went back and forth on this, right? Like the process was very, we collaborated with Games Workshop. They gave us their ideas. I learned a lot about Warhammer lore and about Warhammer like designs in general from this. I loved working on the different factions. I learned a lot because I've never been a big fan of the Imperium armies.
Yep.
So this was my chance to take a look into this. And part of what we focused on that card, interestingly, was the icon of the Imperium, the eye, which inspired one of the other cards, one of the signets that we're going to see later.
Okay. I did want to go back to the card as well, because we've seen this on the last two cards, and so we might as well talk about it here. So we brought back the flavor ability names here that are not named mechanics in the set, but give flavor to them. Can you talk about the use of those in the set, Ethan?
Right. So the sort of North Star for our design efforts and illustration efforts was the Warhammer 40,000 miniatures game. And that's both the miniatures themselves, but also the game manuals that come with them, which are filled with all sorts of lore and background information, as well as the rules for using each of the miniatures. Often, the miniatures will have special abilities, just like Magic cards do, and they'll be named. And so we wanted to pay off people's investment in Warhammer 40,000 by calling back to some of those abilities. And oftentimes, that kind of helps to explain why a card has a specific mechanic also. Like, okay, why am I tapping things and making clue tokens? Oh, because I'm hunting for heresy. You are a heretic. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, let's look at the third deck and leader here, Necron Dynasties, led by, am I saying this right, Zarek the Silent King?
That sounds about right to me.
Cool. Zarek the Silent King is a 3/4 legendary artifact creature Necron. For 1, 3 black, has flying. The ability My Will Be Done. Whenever it attacks, mill 3 cards, and then you can put an artifact, creature, or vehicle card from among those into your hand. So Ethan, what are the Necron all about?
The Necrons are an ancient race of undead robots. They, in their quest for immortality, had their souls transferred into robot bodies, and those robot bodies are made out of a special living metal that can reform itself from any damage. So they will always come back eventually. Sarek was the ancient leader of these people from 60 million years ago, who kind of was in charge of enacting this plan. Didn't go as well as he would have hoped. He, did some soul searching and found himself over the intervening tens of millions of years. But now he's returned to reclaim his throne and is going to be in charge of the entire Necrons again, who are waking up after millions of years of slumber, only to find that many of their planets have since been occupied by what they consider to be lesser races who need to be cleared off so that the Necrons can get about their business.
All right. So, Ovidio, tell us about this piece.
I love this piece. We brought in, one of the coolest things about this is we could bring in some artists who themselves were fans of Warhammer. Anton is one of the newest artists we had signed up at that time. He worked with us in other projects, but he's great at hard surfaces, like great at metal and getting into all that little detail, make it feel believable. And I really love the regal posture that Sarek has. This was art directed by Matt Cavada. And in general, what I love about the Necrons is their like techno-Egyptian pseudo like shape language. They have like even their crests and their little sigils are on coffin shapes. And I loved playing with this. Like I got to relive those games where you're like, oh my god, they're coming back, like because these creatures regenerate on the battlefield when you're playing the mini game. They regenerate on the battlefield, so you have to wait to see if it's gonna happen or not. Brought in a lot of the green is kind of tricky because you need to make sure that it is in gamut, right? Like it prints nice and cool. But I think what's gonna pick it up is the foil. When you see this in foil, it's going to look awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of glowing green effects on those Necron cards that are going to look spectacular.
We don't have a foil Necron card. We are going to show off one of the Surge foils in a little bit, but okay, we'll look for that. All right, let's move to the last deck. So the Tyranid Swarm, and appropriately led by the Swarm Lord. So I'm very intrigued by the Tyranid Swarm. Tell me why these things are awesome.
All right, the Tyranids are a race of extragalactic aliens. They're sort of a cross between dinosaurs and insects. They have a hive mind, so they're all connected together into a gestalt consciousness. They are infinitely adaptable. They find planets, harvest every piece of biomass from the planet, suck up the ocean, suck up the atmosphere into their gigantic spaceship organisms that have been engineered to carry them around space. Any useful genes that they find, they incorporate into the next generation of Tyranids who are now better adapted to fight against the inhabitants of whatever region they find themselves in. If that's not enough, they also have these vanguard organisms called gene stealers that go out ahead of the hive fleets and infiltrate various societies, implant their genes into people who then have half human, half gene stealer hybrid children who are fanatically loyal to the gene stealer cause and eventually rise in revolt against the imperial authorities, leaving the planet's defenses crippled and ready to be eaten by the hive fleet when it arrives.
All right, I'm on board. So tell us about this piece of video, the Swarm Lord.
One thing I was going to say about Tyranids, because this is my favorite type of army. They're also numerous. This art is by Antonio Manzanedo. Antonio Manzanedo is himself an expert at this type of like chitin texture. We paid a lot of attention to the bone sabers, and we depicted the Swarm Lord on the ruins of a golden cathedral. This is what they all want to do, right? Like they want to take over the Imperium. This is what the Imperium fears. They will turn everything into Tyranids, right? We also, in the decks, we also have the Gene Stealer cults, right?
Yep.
And it's, we'll see some of that in one of the other cards I think. But the Swarm Lord is just like super killer. This is a gigantic character. So gigantic that I think we see him in a few other cards, right? Yeah, I love this, specifically the texture work and how like evil he looks. Although like it just looks like it's all made of teeth, like really sharp. I just love that. And I worked with Antonio. Antonio is one of the more experienced Magic artists. We brought in a few. to give it that like magic sheen.
Yeah.
Our approach to the game and how we focus on silhouettes and how we make it so that when you're playing the card, you can tell what the other player has from across the table, right? And this is a great example where we pushed that silhouette. You will know that's a Swarm Lord.
Yeah.
Either because you're afraid of it or because the silhouette can really show.
All right. So those are all cards you've seen before. We are going to get to preview cards. We do want to talk about a couple other cards you've already seen before. Because we're going to talk about some different aspects of them. The first one is the Soul Ring. So we have a short video that shows what the Surge foiling looks like.
There's
so
your glowing Necron.
Yeah,
there's your
the
glowing
green
Necron green. Yeah.
Gonna look awesome.
Yeah. So how much, Ovidio, how much of the time spent on the art did you experiment with the Surge foiling, or was that a consideration and the Surge foiling came after? How did that work?
It comes after. The printing team, the DAs as well, spent quite a lot of time designing the foil very carefully.
Yep.
And so props to them. Really, they've done a great job. I was able to hold the Abaddon card.
The one, oh, really? Hold the Abaddon card, you say?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
so it's right here. So we're not
Yeah.
getting real close. We weren't set up for that today, but you can you don't need to see what the card does, but you can see how that foiling looks
The
in
fire
real
looks
life.
real.
Yeah, it is definitely a unique style of foiling that looks really cool in person.
Yeah, well, you'll wanna throw that down just to show it off. You know, it's an awesome treatment.
Now, that was one of the Soul Rings, and we talked a little bit earlier about flavoring each of the decks. And so one of the things that you did do was take even something that's common across all the decks and give them different art. So the Soul Rings are a great example. So, it's the same card, but obviously a lot of different flavor. What's going on with these four here? And which goes to which faction?
Right, so the first card on the left here is the Soul Ring for the Tyranid deck. We see here the one of the symbols of one of the Gene Stealer cults. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it had something to do with stars or the sun or something. And so, we kind of played into that sun imagery because Soul is the sun.
Yep.
It's the name for the sun. And we get a little quote from Magus Lucia Kane there. The second one here is for the Chaos deck, and you can see the Chaos star in the middle there, the 8-pointed, 8-arrowed star that is the symbol of Chaos. And Abaddon is talking about the historical event when Horus besieged the Sol system at the Siege of Terra, which was the end of the Horus heresy. For the third one here is for the Imperium deck. We see an orrery here with a skull in the middle. This is a servo skull. It's very common for bureaucrats who performed well or people who exemplified heroism or something to be immortalized in a little robot servo skull that flies around and helps people with things. The skull is also symbolic of the emperor, who is caught in a state of near death in the Golden Throne. So the skull symbolically represents the emperor, and so it's in the middle of the orrery here, sort of in pride of place, representing Sol itself. And the quote from a religious text here about how Sol and the emperor are connected conceptually. And then the last one here is, I think this one's my favorite. The Catan are these ancient star gods that the emperor made a bargain with to have their souls put into their metal bodies. But the Catan betrayed them, and the Necrons punished them by breaking them up into shards and trapping the pieces and using them to power their machines. So you can see here an ancient star god has been used as essentially a generator or a battery here for this Soul Ring.
This is the top of a Necron monolith, right?
Right.
Straight from the figure, straight from the miniature.
Okay. So, Ovidio, what was the challenge in getting these to feel very factionalized to their deck, even though they're the same cards?
So, the top lining was super exciting. Mm-hmm. We got some in-house fans, like mega fans of Warhammer, and we all had our own ideas. We all had been looking at the manuals that Games Workshop provided. The first challenge was really what shape does each faction have that can be iconic to them, lore-wise and visually too, right? Like we have to pick something that's not just symbolic, but that it's round, right? That's that soul ring. So the second challenge was getting people to agree. People had their own pet ideas, and they were all awesome. And the ones we came at, I think, were the best solution. Oleg, who did the Imperium Swarm, just really nailed it. Like really hit it off the bat, straight up. It's we came up with the idea of an orrery during top lining when we were talking about the sessions, right? I'm not sure who came up with the idea of the monolith, Necron monolith, but we arrived at stuff that was quite iconic to each faction. And each piece has its own palette, we picked different artists that could do different styles for these also. So that means each artist has their own approach, which means we'll see different results. Even if the ideas had been similar, we would have seen different things, but they weren't. Luckily, we came up with some awesome stuff for people to look at.
Awesome. All right, speaking of awesome stuff for people to look at, let's get into some previews. I'm sure chat is chomping at the bit for some previews. So here's what we're going to show you. We have 7 preview cards. We are going to show 4 that are reprints, but obviously have this new art that is focused on Warhammer 40,000. And then 3 new cards. We figured since tomorrow's deck that's going to be shown off is the Tyranid Swarm, we'd give a little preview of that and show off a few Tyranid cards. So let's start with the reprints, because I found it very interesting how we took these previously Magic cards and flavored them after Warhammer 40,000. So Abundance is the first one. So what is the concept going on here with Abundance?
Right, so here we have some Gene Stealer cultists. You can see some of them are quite alien in their silhouette. You know, that fellow on the top has 6 limbs, it looks like. Maybe the one in the bottom right is from a later generation and looks more like a normal human. And actually, Ovidio, that's a great, because you've mentioned Matt Cavada doing some of the art direction in that. So talk a little bit about the split, how that worked.
We initially split along factional lines.
Okay.
Like you take the Imperium, you take the Gene Stealer cults, you take the Necrons and Chaos, right? We started, I think the process took 2 waves, and I was in the first one. This is an art from the second wave, and it's an artist I brought into the set. It's Irina Nordsol. She did other art that was Imperium themed, but she did a couple that were in the Gene Stealer decks. We picked some, as I said, we prioritized some people who were already fans. And a couple artists wrote us saying, hey, Warhammer and Magic, can I, Darken wrote us like, like, can I get in on that? Like, for sure, mate, go ahead. We're just happy to have more eyes on this, right? So that was a split. On the first wave, Matt worked on the Matt worked on the Necron and the Chaos decks. And I worked on the Tyranids and on the Imperium.
All right, next preview card, going to come as no surprise to anyone here. We have a few versions of Arcane Signet. So which factions do these belong to? What's going on here?
So the left one belongs to the Tyranid deck. and you can see, in this case, it's a literal signet ring, and this person is clearly not entirely human. The skin is peeling back, and you can see the alien chitin and claws being revealed as the cult reveals itself and is in open revolt against the authorities. The middle one here is from the Necron deck. You can see these little robot scarabs are installing this mark of the triarch in the chest of a Necron warrior. So every Necron warrior has one of these symbols on their chest.
Okay.
And then the last one here is from the Imperium deck, and this is a staff used by a psyker, which is sort of a person with psychic powers, which is the equivalent of magic in Warhammer 40,000. And this is the symbol of the group that they belong to, and also is a potent psychic focus.
Okay. And just to confirm here, we aren't holding anything back. There are only 3 of these, correct?
Right. There are 3 Arcane Signets. There's not one in the Chaos deck.
Okay. And then I think it's the same thing with our next preview card, which is Command Tower, which there are 3 versions of those. So what factions are each of those?
Right. Because one of the decks is a monocolor deck, the Necron deck is all black, we didn't make a Command Tower for that deck. So on the left here we have the one for the Tyranid deck. This is a capillary tower, which is an enormous biological construct that funnels air and water up out of the gravity well of the planet. It's like a giant straw that attaches to a huge biological spaceship in orbit, so they can just suck all of the useful resources out of the planet and take it with them, so they can go on to the next planet.
They had fun with those.
Yeah,
There's
like that is some creepy imagery, and we used it more than once. The second one here is for the Chaos deck. This is the Tower of the Cyclops. This is where Magnus the Red lives. He is an ancient demon sorcerer. He lives on the planet of sorcerers. And then the last one here is for the Imperium deck. You can see a scene of a war-torn hive city where a battle is going on involving the Space Marines. And the tower is in the background there. That's some sort of the spire at the top of a hive city, which are these giant arcologies that kind of build up over thousands of years over these planets. 2 of these pieces are art that was reprinted from, that was provided to us by Games Workshop.
Oh.
Yeah, they graciously provided some pieces for us to work with. There are things that they just did awesomely, and we wanted to do right.
Yeah.
By the themes and by the lore. And we decided in some of these cards to just use the art that Games Workshop provided for us. And they have amazing talent working there. Yeah. There's amazing work coming out of them. Their studio is just great. And so I was really proud to have this art in here.
Yeah, okay. All right, last reprint, and actually before we talk about it, talked about reprints, talked about new cards, everything's flavored that way, but what's sort of the balance in a deck between reprints and new cards?
So for these decks, we went with 42 new cards and 58 reprints in each deck.
Okay.
A lot of that was driven by our desire to do right by the creative of Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah.
We wanted to make sure that the decks played well, but we also wanted to make sure that the cards didn't look wrong. Like if there was, a Minotaur here, that would feel weird because there's no Minotaurs in Warhammer 40,000. So we had to choose our reprints carefully, and basically what that meant was all of our reprints, save one, were non-creature cards. So lots of lands, lots of artifacts, some spells. There's one reprinted creature in the entire product, but because there are all of these creature types that, Tyranid, Necron, Astartes,
Right.
etc., that are unique to Warhammer 40,000. And we really wanted the cards to look right to the Warhammer 40,000 fans. So it was important to have the right creature types on the right cards, and to avoid proper nouns that don't belong in Warhammer 40,000.
Which means we're debuting a bunch of new creature types.
That's true.
Yep.
That's true.
Okay, so last reprint then, we have Hardened Scales. What is going on with this card?
This is a spicy one. Now, technically, Tyranids do not have scales. They have chitin, but we stretched it a little bit here because we knew that this card was going to be key to the Tyranid deck for reasons that will become quite clear as we preview the rest of the cards. But I'm sure you can guess that it has something to do with +1/+1 counters. So here we have a Tyranid Carnifex, which is a huge tank-sized organism. It's sort of the Tyranid equivalent of a main battle tank.
With a gun hand.
Yeah, it has a gun organism that spits out little bugs that burrow into people, and can shoot plasma out of its mouth. So so here we see this Tyranid is fully adapted with hardened scales, so that these laser guns being fired by the Astra Militarum are just glancing off of its surface.
And this is an example of an artist that has worked in Magic the Gathering before. They have experience working with us. They know what works on a card. They know what looks awesome. And Matthias just did a great job with this one.
Yeah, it's such a dynamic piece.
Really dynamic, despite the fact that it's like laser gun hits something and then doesn't land. Right? Like it just, but it still calls your attention.
The concept is nothing happens.
Exactly.
All right, cool. Now, we've got 3 new cards to show off. So the first one, again, these are from the Tyranid Swarm deck. The first one that we're going to show off is Broodlord, and I'll read these out because they're new. So for X, 3 and a green, you get a creature, Tyranid. It's a 3/3. Has an ability called Ravenous, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then Brood Telepathy. When Broodlord enters the battlefield, distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of other target creatures you control. So there's that +1/+1 theme that you were talking about. But Ethan, what is Ravenous?
Right, so the Tyranids are always hungry. They're always out to eat more biomass, regardless of whether that is your pet or your mom. So watch out. So they're always hungry. We built a ramp deck with a +1/+1 counter theme for the Tyranids to sort of show off just the huge monsters they have. They have the biggest monsters in the whole game. So Ravenous works a lot like a lot of the Hydras that you've seen, where there's an X in the casting cost and enters with X +1/+1 counters. It does have a little twist here, though. If X is 5 or more, you draw a card when the creature enters the battlefield. Gotcha. So it's sort of there's a threshold of 5 where it's like, okay, you definitely want to get up to 5, and then maybe you want to go past that, or maybe you want to stick with 5 and cast a second spell the same turn.
Yeah.
And then you can see this one is putting +1/+1 counters around on your other creatures, because this is a leader beast. This is a sort of pack leader of the Gene Stealers, and so it can use its Brood Telepathy to let the other creatures know how best to fight the enemy.
He is devouring an unfortunate soldier there.
It's true.
They are always growing. They eat each other. And I think we have a card featuring that somewhere. But people will get a chance to see it.
Okay. All right. Next preview card is Old One-Eye. So this is a legendary creature, so I want to know who this is. But Old One-Eye is 5 and a green for a legendary creature Tyranid. It has Trample. Other creatures you control have Trample. When Old One-Eye enters the battlefield, create a 5/5 green Tyranid creature token. Nice. And then Fast Healing. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may discard 2 cards. If you do, return Old One-Eye from your graveyard to your hand. And it's a 6/6. So who is Old One-Eye?
All right, I'm gonna try to flex my lore muscles here. If I recall correctly, after the Battle of Calth during the First Tyrannic War, some people came upon a glacier with a huge Tyranid organism frozen inside. It had been blasted with a plasma weapon on its face, and so it was missing an eye. And when they dug it out and thawed it out, it came to life and started eating everybody.
Yeah.
It was eventually subdued and killed, but then, a few years later, a very similar-looking creature was discovered on a completely different planet. So the consciousness of Old One-Eye had been absorbed by the hive mind and sort of redeployed somewhere else in a new body. But Old One-Eye was always missing an eye due to some weird little quirk. So he is one of those huge carnifexes that are these tank organisms, and he comes with more carnifexes in the form of these tokens.
I have no basis on which to challenge any of that lore knowledge, so consider it flexed.
All right.
Someone else may tell us but I believe you. All right, last card. So this is pretty cool because one of the things your team did was use sagas to tell some of the stories and lore. Anytime that there's a set that has old lore, old stories, sagas seem to show up and help tell those stories. So you're gonna have to tell us a little bit about this story, flex that lore knowledge again. So the first Tyrannic War. So this is a saga that costs 2, a green, a blue, and a red. Has 3 chapters, of course, and you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. If its mana cost contains X, which is that Tyranid Ravenous ability, it enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of lands you control. And then chapters 2 and 3, double the number of each kind of counter on target creature you control. All right, so what was the first Tyrannic War?
Right, every deck contains one saga relating a really important event from that faction's history. In the case of the Tyranids, it's the first Tyrannic War. Unlike the Necrons and Chaos, the Tyranids are a relatively recent threat to the Imperium, appearing only a few hundred years ago. Okay. And this huge hive fleet called Hive Fleet Behemoth entered the galaxy and just drove straight toward the center of the galaxy, eating every planet they met until they ran into the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge. The Ultramarines are bioengineered super soldiers wearing power armor with all sorts of extra organs that make them superhuman, and their planet is extremely well fortified. So nobody could casually attack their planet. So eventually the Hive Fleet attacked the planet and broke against Macragg's defenses. The Ultramarines took tremendous losses, and have only recently recovered from this huge battle where they exhausted all of their strength defending against the Tyranids. In the art here, you can see this is a holographic projection, probably somewhere in the Ultramarines Fortress Monastery, and you can see Marneus Calgar, the leader of the Ultramarines, fighting against the Swarm Lord in the art there.
All right. In the video, so there's a saga for each of the factions. That process for creating art for sagas is a bit different, correct?
Yes, indeed. There was the artistic challenge with sagas is that we've conceded them as in-world art that was made.
Yeah.
In the dark future, there's very little room for art, right? So each of the sagas has a different way of walking around that. And in this case, it's a holographic projection of the battle itself, right? It's technological, it's functional, it's usable, right? It's something that you can imagine being used in the battlefield or in a room planning for battle, right? So it has to be plausible too. Like, I don't imagine a soldier of the Imperium stopping to make a nice oil painting of the battle and so on. So we had to approach it in a very different way.
Yeah. All right, makes sense. Okay, so those are all of the preview cards we have today, but there is still a ton to show off from these commander decks that are going to be coming over the next 4 days. So let's give you the schedule. Now, if you want to, you can just head to dailymtg.com, and there is an article called Where to Find Warhammer 40,000 previews. That will have all the details, and you don't even have to listen to me, but you're here, you might as well. So the way we're breaking this up is each deck has its own day. So tomorrow is the Tyranid Swarm, as we said. Day after that, the Ruinous Powers. The day after that is Necron Dynasty, and finally we will end on Friday with Forces of the Imperium. The way the day is going to go is in the morning, I'm talking Pacific Standard Time right now. In the morning, you will see previews from various outlets, both in the Magic and Warhammer spaces. So we met with some Warhammer 40,000 content creators and people who make YouTube videos or stream or are excellent painters or whatever, and gave them some preview cards so that they could relate a lot of the Warhammer 40,000 lore, as Ethan has done here. And then we've got some Magic folks who have done the same thing, you know, translating from Magic, but we've tried to find some Warhammer fans in the Magic community. And on that note, we've done that as well with the full deck reveals. So you'll see somewhere around 10 to 15 cards in the morning. And then at approximately 2 p.m., Pacific Standard Time again, one content creator, a Magic content creator who has really deep Warhammer 40,000 knowledge, will show off the rest of the deck. And I mean the rest of the deck. They have a lot to show. So Tyranid Swarm, MTG Mudsta is going to show that off. The Ruinous Powers will be demonstrated by Loading Ready Run. Game Nights will handle the Necron Dynasty on Thursday, and then Warhammer 40,000 Superfan Pleasant Kenobi will handle the Forces of the Imperium deck to round out the week. So definitely tune in for all of that the rest of the week. Warhammer 40,000 Commander decks release on October 7th, so definitely check that out. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you two for sharing all of the background knowledge and insights on making these really cool decks. Stay tuned for all the previews, and we'll see you next week.